In the early 1900s, somewhere in the American West, a small town existed beside a desert river. People were born there, worked the land, buried their families in its soil. It did not collapse. It was not abandoned by accident. A decision was made far away, and the town was erased. This is the story of a place removed from history. At the beginning of the 20th century, the American West was still shaped by isolation and necessity. In southern Nevada, near a bend of the Colorado River, a modest settlement slowly formed. It was known as St. Thomas. There was no formal founding moment, no ceremony. The town emerged as people stayed instead of moving on. The river defined everything. It provided water in a landscape that offered little mercy. Farmers carved shallow irrigation channels by hand. Fields appeared where desert should have dominated. Alfalfa, corn, and small gardens survived against expectation. Livestock grazed near the banks. Without the river, the town could not exist. Most residents were families. Some arrived by wagon decades earlier. Others came later, drawn by land that was cheap and permanent. Homes were built from wood, stone, and whatever materials could be transported across long distances. A church followed. Then a schoolhouse. A post office connected the town to the outside world. A cemetery grew slowly, one grave at a time. Life in St. Thomas was repetitive but stable. Days began early. Work ended with the sun. Sundays were reserved for church and rest. Children walked dirt roads to school. Community gatherings filled evenings. The town was small, but it functioned. It appeared on maps. It elected local officials. People expected to remain there for life. Beyond the town, however, the country was changing. Cities expanded rapidly. Industry demanded electricity. Agriculture demanded reliable water. Rivers were no longer seen as boundaries. They became assets to be controlled. Engineers began surveying the Colorado River. Reports documented floods, droughts, and wasted potential. Solutions were discussed in offices far removed from the desert. At first, these developments meant little to St. Thomas. The river had always risen and fallen. Seasonal change was familiar. No one imagined it could be transformed into something permanent and destructive. But by the 1920s, signs appeared. Survey teams arrived. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground. Officials spoke in careful language about future plans. They avoided certainty. They avoided responsibility. Still, unease settled in. The town continued to function. Crops were planted. Children attended school. Burials continued. Yet beneath daily routine, something had shifted. For the first time, permanence was no longer guaranteed. By the early 1930s, uncertainty in St. Thomas could no longer be ignored. The federal government had approved the construction of a massive dam downstream on the Colorado River. Its purpose was described clearly: flood control, hydroelectric power, long-term water storage. The consequences were discussed less openly. New maps circulated. Survey lines became boundaries. On paper, the future reservoir expanded outward, covering valleys, farms, and towns. St. Thomas lay directly in its path. Government representatives arrived with documents and measurements. They spoke calmly. They spoke professionally. Residents were informed that the town would eventually be flooded. Not immediately. Not violently. But completely. Relocation was presented as inevitable. Negotiable details were offered. The outcome was not Compensation varied. Some families accepted payments quickly, fearing they would lose everything if they delayed. Others challenged the assessments, arguing that land passed down through generations could not be priced. Disputes stretched on. Decisions were postponed. Time moved forward regardless. As dam construction progressed, the river began to change. Its behavior grew unpredictable. Water levels rose earlier in the year. Fields nearest the banks flooded without warning. Crops failed mid-season. Irrigation channels overflowed or collapsed. Wells turned muddy and undrinkable. Daily life became unstable. Livestock had to be moved to higher ground. Homes closest to the river were abandoned first. Doors and windows were removed for reuse elsewhere. Wooden structures were dismantled piece by piece. What could be carried was taken. What could not was left behind. The school closed quietly. Enrollment dropped until there were not enough children to justify keeping it open. The post office followed. Mail routes were redirected. The town's connection to the outside world weakened, then disappeared. Church services became irregular. Eventually, they stopped. Families left in stages. Wagons, trucks, and carts carried belongings away from the river. Some residents relocated nearby. Others moved hundreds of miles away. There were no organized departures. No farewell gatherings. The town emptied unevenly. A small number of people remained. Some had nowhere else to go. Others refused to accept the outcome. They believed the water would stop rising. They believed the plans would change. They were wrong. By the mid-1930s, St. Thomas no longer functioned as a town. It existed only as a place not yet submerged. Waiting. The end of St. Thomas did not arrive suddenly. It advanced slowly, measured in inches of rising water in days without return. There was no single moment that marked the town's final hour. Instead, disappearance unfolded as a process. As the reservoir began to fill in earnest, the river crossed boundaries that had once defined safety. Water covered the lowest fields first. Then the roads. Familiar paths vanished beneath a thin, reflective surface. Movement through the town became difficult. Then impossible. The remaining residents watched from higher ground. They saw structures surrender one by one. A barn collapsed after weeks of saturation. Wooden walls softened and failed. Roofs slipped into the water without sound. No effort was made to save them. There was nothing left to negotiate. The cemetery resisted longer than most places. Its elevation delayed the inevitable. Grave markers stood alone, surrounded by water, until they too disappeared. Some families had already removed their dead. Others could not. The ground was too wet. The cost too high. Those graves were left where they lay. Official attention moved elsewhere. The dam was complete. The reservoir was filling as planned. Engineers recorded water levels. Reports were filed. St. Thomas was no longer mentioned. It was already considered resolved. When the last occupied structure became unlivable, the final residents left. There were no witnesses to the town's complete submersion. No photographs marking the moment. The water simply continued to rise. Eventually, nothing remained above the surface. Streets, buildings, and foundations vanished beneath the reservoir. The water smoothed itself. Reflections replaced detail. From above, there was no sign that a town had ever existed. Maps were revised. The name St. Thomas was removed. Roads leading to it ended abruptly. Future visitors would see only water. The absence was total. For decades, the town remained submerged. Occasionally, during drought years, the water receded. Stone foundations reappeared. Cracked walls surfaced briefly. Tourists walked among the remains without context. Few understood what they were standing on. Then the water returned. The town disappeared again. Each time, more completely. Until even the ruins became unfamiliar. Until memory itself faded. The water covered everything. Houses. Roads. Fields. Voices stopped. Footsteps ended. The town name vanished. From maps. From records. From memory. Children born after its disappearance never learned it existed. Stories told by elders were lost in time. Photographs faded. Letters rotted in boxes. Documents decayed in basements. The past receded like the water itself. No one marked anniversaries. No one returned. The reservoir reflected the sky. Its surface was smooth. Still. Silent. Beneath it lay St. Thomas. Foundations, walls, streets, remnants of lives once lived. Pressed into darkness. Forgotten. Occasionally, during periods of drought, the water retreated. Stone walls appeared. Cracked foundations. A fence leaning at an impossible angle. A road leading nowhere. Ghostly traces of a town erased. Tourists wandered among them. Cameras clicked. Few understood. No signs explained. No guidebooks mentioned the history. The town remained nameless. Even the cemeteries were submerged. Grave markers, simple stones, disappeared beneath the water. Families who could not relocate their dead lost their connection permanently. Burial plots were forgotten. Names once spoken daily fell silent. History itself seemed to refuse remembrance. The dam continued to control the river. Engineers measured water levels. Officials recorded data. Nothing indicated a town had ever existed there. Its erasure was complete. Total. Quiet. Sometimes, the water receded so far that the tallest walls or chimneys reappeared. The structures were skeletal, broken, weathered. They told no story beyond absence. Children on distant shores played nearby, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Time moved forward. Memory did not. Eventually, the water returned. The remains were covered again. And again. Each time, the town sank deeper into oblivion. Slowly, even the shape of buildings blurred. Streets disappeared. The cemetery vanished. The river became a mirror. A reflection of sky and nothing else. St. Thomas was no longer a town. It was a memory, only remembered by those who had left before the water claimed it. Even they passed away. Their stories, if told, could not be verified. There was no evidence left on the land. Only water. The town, once alive, now existed only in absence. Empty streets. Silent buildings. Hidden graves. Forgotten lives. The reservoir covered all, leaving only quiet. History had moved on. St. Thomas remained underwater, unseen, unspoken, and removed from all maps. Time passed. Generations forgot. The river kept its secret. And the town remained gone. Thank you for watching. New historical stories are published regularly.